Zach is back. It's the Zach Gelb Show on Fox Sports 920 The Jersey.
Welcome back in. Zach Gelb Show time in the Princeton Orthopedic Associates studios is 5:17. Tim Duncan, we found out, is retiring, and now joining us on the hotline is a man that has called many Tim Duncan great games, the Spurs radio play-by-play voice, and that's Bill Schoening, a Philadelphia native, and Bill joins us right now. Bill, thanks for a few minutes, and how are you?
I'm very good, Zach. Been busy the last couple of days. My long summer got interrupted by Tim's announcement the other day.
Yeah, we'll talk about Tim in just a little bit, but whenever I get a guy on that's from Philadelphia, I need to know, what's your favorite cheesesteak place?
Oh, wow. There's a bunch of them. There's a place called D'Alessandro's that I really
Love
like.
it.
That was Malik Rose's favorite place. So Malik Rose, who, of course, is a native of Philadelphia, went to Overbrook High and played for the Spurs for 8 years. He turned me on to that place, and believe it or not, even to this day, even though Malik hasn't played for us since 2005, over the last, 11 seasons now, every time we go to Philly and get on the plane to leave Philly and go elsewhere, we have D'Alessandro's cheesesteaks, courtesy of Malik Rose, waiting for us on the charter.
I love D'Alessandro's. I also love this place called Mama's, and we know that in Philadelphia we have good cheesesteaks, and we also have good announcers. Who were some of the announcers when you were a kid growing up that you idolized in Philadelphia?
I guess the number one guy would be Bill Campbell, because Bill Campbell did the Phillies, the Sixers, and the Eagles at different times during his career. My favorite basketball guy was Bill Campbell. My favorite baseball guy was Byram Som, who was getting along in years by the time I was in high school. I believe By retired after the 75 season. And years later, right before he passed away, I was able to interview him on a radio show that I did in Austin, Texas, and it was really a thrill for me to be able to tell By how much he meant to me.
So what kind of sports fan were you growing up as a kid? I'm assuming you rooted for all the Philadelphia teams, right?
I still root for all the Philadelphia teams. In fact, I kid with Tom McGinnis, my friend who's the voice of the Sixers, that I pull for the Sixers 80 times a year. The only 2 times I don't pull for the Sixers is when they play the Spurs, and because I know where the paycheck is coming from.
It looks like they have one serious player in Ben Simmons, and there's going to be many good times for years to come with the Sixers, though, Bill.
I certainly hope so. Brett Brown's an old friend. Of course, he worked for the Spurs for almost a decade, and I got to work with Brett very closely. He did a lot of the post-game interviews with us, and I'm hoping now that he's got some material, because he's a really, really good coach. And, it's been very, very difficult, obviously, for him coming from a winning environment to suffer through those losing seasons with such a young roster. But now maybe they'll turn the corner. I certainly hope so.
Yeah, and you say he's a really good coach, and I do believe that from some of the things that I've seen. But just having that experience with him for so many years, tell my listening audience why he's such a good coach, because you're right. The last few years, you really haven't been able to see his coaching capabilities with the Sixers.
He worked very closely with a lot of the younger players in the Spurs program and developed them. He's a director of player development. Obviously, Australia is now on the map in basketball, and I think he's got a big, factor in that. Brett was a very important player in the Australian team. He was the head coach of the Australian Olympic team for a while. He was a head coach, I believe, of the Melbourne team in the professional league there in Australia, and he traveled throughout that country doing a lot of clinics. So, you see a lot of players now. I believe there's 7 or 8 players from Australia playing in the NBA, and Brett Brown certainly had his hand in that.
Bill Schoening joins us right now, the radio voice for the San Antonio Spurs. And Tim Duncan, hey, growing up like myself, being a young guy only at the age of 21, I have so much respect for Tim Duncan, and I got to see him win a lot of championships and also take down my Nets as I grew up as a Nets fan. But the big news broke the other day, and hey, there was no other way that you expected Tim Duncan to go. It was nice and quiet, and he's always has been that quiet superstar, Bill.
Yeah, no big surprise in the way he did it. He wasn't even at the press conference yesterday. Coach Popovich did about 15 minutes on Tim. Tim was nowhere to be found. That's not a big surprise. Tim never was looking for the spotlight. In fact, always kind of shied away from it and wanted other players and other people in the organization to get credit when he took a back seat. But, think about through the years what he has meant to the organization, really the backbone, the face of the program, the franchise player. And just a marvelous guy, very selfless, as I mentioned. And you listen to all of the accolades he gets from his teammates. I think that's the highest compliment a player can get, is when he gets praised by his teammates. They say he's the best teammate they ever had. Especially late in his career, I got to see him really do a lot of counseling, a lot of mentoring of the younger players, guys who were new in the program. He would always take a minute, put his arm around them, and show them what they might have done wrong, pat them on the backside if they did something right. Just a really good teammate, and really the reason why the Spurs have had such a great culture in that locker room for such a long period of time.
And he's an all-time great, and if he wanted to, he could have got that farewell tour like a Derek Jeter or what a David Ortiz is going through now, or even what we saw with Mariano Rivera a few years back, but that isn't Tim. You know him better than most people. Why is he so humbled? Because he's had all this success. You would think that maybe he wouldn't be humbled at sometimes, though.
Well, I think that when you go back to his upbringing, he grew up very modestly in the Virgin Islands, St. Croix. He was really a swimmer before he was a basketball player. Then Hurricane Hugo destroyed his pool, and he started playing basketball. Dave Odom recruited him to play at Wake Forest. He was certainly a project when Dave Odom got him. And I heard an interview with Dave Odom the other day talking about how humble Tim was in the very beginning. So I think you got to go back to his parents to give him a very humble background in the very, very beginning. And then, of course, when he got to the Spurs, David Robinson was there. So David, of course, a very, very good guy. And I think he learned from the best when he learned from David Robinson. Of course, Coach Popovich and Tim have had really a very unique relationship over a 19-year period. They were right on the same page from the very beginning, and they had unprecedented success. Not only did Tim only play for one team for 19 years, he only played for one coach, and that is unheard of in today's modern sports world.
When he walked off the court for what now we know it as the final time, did you think that was the last time you were ever going to see Tim Duncan in a Spurs uniform in the playoffs?
I really did. I honestly did.
Same.
People asked me about that afterwards, and I said it was just a gut feeling, just an instinct. Having seen Tim play every game for the last 15 years, I just got that feeling. To be honest with you, I also had the same feeling about Manu Ginobili. But Manu's going to come back for at least one more year, so I'm very happy about that. Because it would have been a big gaping hole in terms of leadership if both those guys had left. But Manu will be back for one more year. But Tim, I just had that feeling, because he was still productive on the floor, but he only averaged 9 points and 8 rebounds. He was still a very good defender. But I just got the feeling at the end of that series when they lost Oklahoma City in the Western Conference semifinals that was going to be it. But as you mentioned earlier, no fanfare, no farewell tour, no big glitz and glamour. Tim just basically, even in the press conference, or in the press release, I should say, that the Spurs sent out, there were no quotes. It was just basically his accolades, and he had a bunch of them, as you know. I think the most impressive thing, other than his 5 championships and the 7-10 winning percentage, think about that, Zach. The Spurs won 71% of the games when Tim Duncan was there for 19 years. But only 2 players in NBA history, Tim Duncan and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, have recorded 26,000 points, 15,000 rebounds, and 3,000 blocks. That's how dominant Tim Duncan was. He's right in the same conversation as Kareem Abdul-Jabbar.
Another thing that I thought was so impressive was what he did at the end of his career in his later years, because they lost that final to the Heat in 2013, and then they bounced back and won in 2014 and were able to win that in 5 games. Especially at their age, it was a tremendous coaching job by Pop, but also the effort from the players to bounce back at that age was just something really fun to watch.
That loss in 13 hurt all of us. I'm just a play-by-play guy, and I couldn't sleep that night. I can imagine, and I'm serious about that, and I can imagine how the players felt. You could hear a pin drop on that bus going back to the team hotel after that game, and it was just very difficult for all of us. And then we still had another game. There was still Game 7, and the Spurs had opportunities in Game 7, but didn't win. So that was a very, very difficult loss, but the entire team came back intact. Pop decided to keep everybody there and try it again. And that entire season was just really magical because the way they came together and played hard. And they wanted a chance at Miami in the finals. They wanted to get back to that spot, and they dominated that series. 4-1. They shot 54% from the field. They set all kinds of records in terms of the dominance that they had over the Miami Heat, a 2-time defending champion with the reigning league MVP. It was probably the most satisfying win, I would imagine, in Tim's career. Certainly in my 36 years doing play-by-play, it was the most fun I ever had during that series.
Bill Schoening joins us right now for a few more minutes talking about Tim Duncan. So you became the Spurs play-by-play voice in 2001. Take me back to the first time when you met Tim Duncan.
He was very quiet and shy. I had a chance to talk to him about Wake Forest a little bit because I had been the radio play-by-play voice for the Texas Longhorns for 12 years. And during that period of time, we played Wake Forest with Tim Duncan. I believe it was the 95-96 season in Milwaukee. Tim was sick in that game. He played, and he had like 12 points and 11 rebounds, kind of a pedestrian game for him, but he was very sick. But Wake Forest beat us on a three-pointer by a guy named Ricky Peral, who was from South America. So it wasn't really Duncan who beat the Longhorns. It was a guy named Ricky Peral. But I visited with Tim about that. He remembered. He's one of these guys who remembers everything. He's a very intelligent guy, but, again, very unassuming, very quiet, very laid back, and doesn't bring attention to himself. So, and years later, when I got to know him a lot better, he only called me Philly because P.J. Carlissimo gave me this nickname, Philly Billy, and it stuck my first year with the Spurs. So that was it. Malik Rose and Tim Duncan started calling me that, so the whole team did. So Tim never called me Bill, only called me Philly. And whenever the Eagles lost a game, he would be all over me because he knew that I was an Eagles fan. He was a big Chicago Bears and still is a big Chicago Bears fan. So Tim's got a great sense of humor. He doesn't let a lot of people see it, but he's got it. And, his teammates, you can talk to any of the guys that played with him. He was a practical joker, a lot of fun. And he could take a joke, and he could also dish one out as well.
As Bill Schoening joins us right now. So how is life going to look for the Spurs after Tim Duncan? It's going to be bizarre next year, I bet, when you call your first game.
It'll be a little weird for sure, but I do think that they've got a very good nucleus coming back. LaMarcus Aldridge obviously is a very good power forward. They've got Pau Gasol now to play center for the next couple of years toward the tail end of his career. I think he'll fit right in with that international load that the Spurs have, and they've got some very good young players. Kawhi Leonard, the two-time reigning NBA Defensive Player of the Year. They've got two guys who are playing very well right now in the Summer League, and Jonathan Simmons and Kyle Anderson. They still have Tony Parker for a couple of more years, so they still have some very good players in this program. They won 67 games last year, and Tim averaged 9 points and 8 rebounds. So they're going to miss his leadership. They'll miss his defense. I think they can make up those 9 points and 8 rebounds with other guys there, but certainly it'll be a big gaping hole in terms of the leadership. But I think that on the floor, they're going to be okay. I'm not expecting them necessarily to win 67 games again, but I do think that they'll continue their stretch of 50 wins. Zach, they've won 50 games at least in each of the last 17 years, and that is an NBA record by far. In fact, the previous team to have done that was the L.A. Lakers with Magic Johnson from 79 to 91. So they've surpassed that by 5 years. So I expect them to continue to play solid basketball. Obviously, the Warriors are going to be the team to beat with their recent signing of Kevin Durant, but I wouldn't be surprised at all to see the Spurs right there at the top of the Western Conference or very close to it come playoff time next year if they stay healthy.
And it's just human nature when a guy retires, and that's what we do here on Sports Talk Radio. We try to rank them, and people have that debate, is Tim Duncan the greatest power forward of all time? And he didn't play his entire career at the four, but to me, he's the greatest four of all time. Where do you lie in that argument?
Well, I don't argue with that. I got to see him up close and personal for 15 years, and he always wanted to be called a power forward. He jumps center sometimes, and yes, he's a low post player, but he also can play the high post and step out. One of the best bank shots from the wing of anybody that's ever played the game. And I just mentioned those numbers. They're right up there with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar with the 26,000 points, 15,000 boards, and 3,000 blocks. So, yeah, I would put him up there as the best power forward of all time. Especially with the 5 championships, the 710 winning percentage, and the 1,000 wins in one uniform. Only 3 players have won 1,000 games, and he's one of them, and he's the only player to win 1,000 games in one uniform. So yeah, hard to argue against Tim and all the success he had as a power forward in his career.
And they'll make all these historical TV shows and everything like that. They'll do a lot of stuff on Tim Duncan for many more years to come, and I'm assuming you'll be a frequent guest on those because it doesn't seem like Tim is going to do too many of those shows. But let's just say in 20 years, a kid comes up to you and goes, Bill, you were able to see Tim Duncan play. How would you describe what him and Popovich were able to do for the Spurs? What would you say?
I would say that it was all about the culture. Greg Popovich, the number one thing he tells guys when they come to the program for the first time is get over yourself. And what that means is don't worry about your stats. Don't worry about making the All-Star team. Don't worry about averaging 20 points a game or getting on Sports Center. Don't beat your chest. Don't give the other team a lot of locker room material. Go out and play. Just play basketball. Respect your opponent. Pop always calls it fear the opponent. And Tim heard that message loud and clear. And if you watch any of the highlights from Tim Duncan's career, he shows emotion. Certainly in the playoffs, it's a very emotional time. And there's a lot goes into, working hard and winning. And he'll show emotion. But I don't think he ever did anything to belittle an opponent. I always thought he won with class.
Now, before we let you run, you spent a year at Temple, if my research is correct. I'm a Temple owl. How was your time at Temple University?
Oh, I love Temple. I had an opportunity to go to a broadcasting school. I was very anxious to get into the business, and I knew I was going to have to wait a while if I stayed all 4 years at Temple. So I was able to transfer some of my scholarship money to a small broadcasting school that no longer exists in downtown Philadelphia. But you just mentioned Temple, and I spent a nice summer afternoon this year with Fran Dunphy down the shore at Avalon, where he's got a beautiful summer home. Great guy. We have a mutual friend in Fran O'Hanlon, who's the head coach at Lafayette. And before your time, Zach, Fran was a very good player at Villanova during the same period of time that Fran Dunphy was a player at LaSalle. And that's how I grew up. I grew up a kid watching those guys play at the Palestra when I was just 8, 9, 10 years old. So I look up to both Fran O'Hanlon and Fran Dunphy, who at one time the head coach and the assistant coach at the University of Pennsylvania. So I just love the Palestra. I grew up in that building, and it's still my favorite building on the planet.
Have you ever called a game from the Palestra?
It's funny that you asked that. You probably are very familiar with, I'll think of his name in a second. He's the play-by-play voice of the Penn Quakers, and he also works on the radio side for the 76ers doing pregame and postgame. Anyway, he asked me if I would do the Penn-Princeton game this year because he knew that was on my bucket list to do the game. Brian Seltzer is the guy's name. He just slipped my mind for a moment. Yeah, Brian's a great guy. And Brian asked me to do the Penn-Princeton game this year, so I was able to do the Princeton overtime victory over the Quakers, the Ivy League opener, on January 9th at the Palestra. So I scratched that one off my bucket list. I absolutely had a great time.
There's nothing like calling a game at the Palestra, and Princeton's actually right up the road to us, and Kerry Kittles is now going to be assistant on that Princeton staff. But, Bill, this is a whole lot of fun. Let me tell you, next time you're in Philly, I'll be meeting you at the airport and giving you a D'Alessandro's or a Mama's cheesesteak, so I appreciate the time.
All right, bring some soft pretzels too, Zach.
All right. Now you're getting a little bit picky there. I don't know if I have that budget.
Okay, you got it.
All right, there he is, Bill Schoening, joining us on the Zach Gelb Show, Fox Sports 920 The Jersey. So there's some perspective about Tim Duncan from a guy that is from Philadelphia and then got to call the Spurs games ever since 2001.